Thanks everybody for coming again today. This is a different subject, very interesting as well. I would like not to take any time now because there were many questions yesterday we couldn't handle, so to leave much time at the end of the lecture. So thank you very much again, Roy. And the floor is yours.
Okay, very good. Good morning. I said yesterday that when you start to get sick, you should go to bed. I probably should have done that on Wednesday instead of traveling for 12 hours under stressful conditions. But I hope I can speak for today. I want to say thank you for various people who have contributed to this research and funded it as well. The starting idea was that psychology thinks much more about the past than the future. Through much of the history of psychology, we seek to explain behavior based on things that happened in the past. The most influential theories for many years were Freud's psychoanalysis, which pointed to childhood experiences to explain adult behavior, and B.F. Skinner's learning theories, which looked at reinforcement history, that your behavior is determined by what was rewarded and punished in the past. So focus on the past to explain the present. Meanwhile, in thought processes, there are endless studies of memory, whole journals devoted to it, how much people remember. Again, that's mainly about the past. However, as my friend Marty Seligman pointed out, in my own thinking, I seem to think much more about the future than the past. So maybe psychology should start to pay attention to how people think about the future. Now, we may study the past more because it's easier to study the past than the future. There are objective facts in the past. The future is not yet objectively there. Nevertheless, tremendously important. Also, recent advances suggest that the areas of the brain used to remember the past are also used for projecting into the future, and it's more adaptive to think about the future than the past. Many of the faults that we found in memory that were simply considered design flaws in the human brain. For example, each time you remember something, you remember it slightly differently. And each time you remember something, the memory is colored by your current wants and needs, your motivational state. Well, they said, okay, that's just flaws in how the memory works, but those are advantages if you give that those brain areas evolve to think about the future, as how you think about the future should start from where you are now, and your current wants and needs should shape how you think about the future. Thinking about the future obviously has various adaptive advantages. You can still do something about it. Simple animals respond only to the present. More complicated brains learn from the past and import that into the present. That helps. But if you can project what's going to happen into the future, that's even better. Whether evolution has a direction, that's much debated. Some say, well, the environment changes at random and then organisms adapt to it, so that in a sense is random too. Others say, no, there are directions. For example, simpler organisms evolve into more complex ones. Yeah, I wish. Evolve into more complex ones. Another direction of evolution may be increasing ability to think about the future. Animals pretty much live in the present. Some can project very briefly in terms of expectancies into the future, but only humans have gotten to where we can project for months, years, even decades into the future. All right, let me start with a study of people's thoughts in everyday life. The goals, this is one large study we did a few years ago. The idea was to see what happens in what people are thinking about in everyday life. In contrast, there are thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of human thinking, studies of human thinking in the laboratory, but that's where we tell people what to think about and measure how they think. So this is what do people think outside the laboratory when no one is telling them what to think about. The method for this, we programmed people's cell phones, 500 people, about half of them students, but others from various walks of life. And the cell phone was programmed to go off at random points during the day, at which point they're supposed to report what was the most recent thought in your mind. And the idea was then to find a large sample of what people are actually thinking in their everyday lives. 6 signals a day for 3 days, and they answered a series of questions about it. To learn about the time, we asked them, were you thinking about the past, the present, and or the future? Now, different people might mean, what is the present? What does it constitute? So we had to make an a priori decision so everybody's responding on the same basis. So we said 5 minutes. The future starts in 5 minutes. The past ended 5 minutes ago, so the present is 10 minutes long. Sorry about that. So, how often do people think about these? Well, out of the total thoughts, people think 3.5 times as much about the future than the past. Now, the way we set up the experiment, they could say yes to the past and the present and the future or any combination. So we look at the combinations. The only common one was the present plus the future. And so if you add how much people are thinking about the future only, present and future, past, present, and future, and past and future, then there's quite a bit of thinking about the future. Still, first point, my friend was right. People think much more about the future than the past. Now, when they're thinking about the future, what are they thinking about? Well, mostly later today. They're not thinking about next century or anything like that. Thinking about what happens after your life is a very small proportion of them. And they could check more than one answer here, but later today is very common. What am I going to have for lunch tomorrow, and so on. The future drops off after about a year from now, substantially. So, people mainly think about the near future. The past, kind of the same, only it's a longer shelf. It really drops off after about 10 years. So we can think farther back in the past than into the future, but we think more into the future, and especially the near future. There were some thoughts for which people did not respond. And essentially, they said no to past and present and future, so there's no time dimension at all. When they rated these thoughts, these are less meaningful than other thoughts, or less under voluntary control. They're less exciting, less happy, less anxious, and so on. More about themselves than others. Not pleasant. The implication of this is the richness of human experience occurs within time. So the thoughts that have any time element, meaningfulness, emotion, and so on, occur with a time dimension. Thoughts without time are less less rich in that way. Also, social life, we asked them, are there other people present when you had this thought? The more they were with other people, the more thoughts were in time. So thinking out without time dimension happens mainly when you're not around other people. And other people particularly keep you here and now in the present. So the more other people were there, the present was particularly potent. They were doing whatever they were doing. So it was at random points throughout the day. Some were working, some were studying, riding the bus, cooking dinner. I suppose they might be having sex, but I doubt they stopped to do a questionnaire when they were having sex. Okay, content of thoughts. In terms of the past, well, this was a bit of a surprise. So remember, there are not that many thoughts about the past. The most common category was the implications of the past for the future. So even when they're thinking about the past, a lot of the times it's how to relate it to the future. There are plenty of other things, replaying thoughts over and over, kind of ruminating. Common ones were trying to make sense, understand what happened, what should have happened, what might have been. There we go. Learning lessons from the past, how to fix a problem that started in the past. So these longer bars reflect those. Putting these together, trying to come up with what they mean. Implications of the past for the future. So that's a very pragmatic orientation. Also trying to understand. Replaying the past. Also humans, we replay the past counterfactually. Like, if I hadn't said this, or suppose that hadn't happened, or Suppose I had stayed in bed. So this is an important way that humans learn from their past experiences, not just replaying what happened, but how it could have gone differently. Again, other animals seem probably unable to do that. And some ruminating. So for a quick summary of the past, when they think about the past, it's so what and what the heck. The so what is what are the implications of the past for present and future, and what the heck is trying to figure out the meaning of what happened. Thoughts about the present. The most common ones, what am I supposed to do, what I intend to do, paying attention to what I'm doing my job. Implications of present for the future was also quite common. So a lot of pragmatic, doing what I'm supposed to do, doing my job. But there's also enjoying the moment, savoring it to some degree. So thinking about the present, figuring out what's going on, doing what you're doing, implications for the future, but also some, oh, this is fun and I should enjoy this. Now, about the future, also a surprise, by far the most common, 3/4 of the thoughts about the future are planning. So planning is a very common activity that humans engage in. When we're thinking about the future, we're preparing for action. Now, there are other sorts of things, imagining, thinking about other people will do, what you hope will happen, what you hope to do, wondering what's going to happen, possible future emotions, choosing, deciding. But again, planning by far more common than others. So thinking about the future is highly pragmatic. Pragmatic means preparing for what to do. And I bring this up because, as I'll say later in the talk, mostly when psychologists have studied the future, it's try to predict what will happen. But predicting is not as important as preparing for action. Planning is much more common. Emphasizing possibilities, what might happen, what could go wrong, what could go right. That's often there as well, or what you want to happen and don't want to happen. So we're calling this, thinking of the future as the matrix of maybe, rather than thinking there's a path and this is definitely going to be what's going to happen. It's thinking of all the different possibilities and how do I deal with them to get the ones that I want. Because planning was so common, we paid special attention to planning. Come on. Freeze up. There we go. Planning compared to other thoughts about the future was rated higher on being meaningful. It was more pleasant to think about the future. If you're not planning, often you're worrying, which is not as pleasant. Planning reduces stress. This is perhaps useful. When you're worried about something in the future, if you make a plan to deal with it, that seems to help to some degrees. Planning, people report high control over their thoughts. It's not your thoughts are running on and automatically planning, but rather planning takes careful mental discipline and effort. They don't plan as much when they're mentally tired, and it's highly involving. All right, for the next part, I'm going to talk about the subjective experience. What does it feel like to think about the future, the past, and so on? So we took each thought. Now remember, they could code different times. I'm thinking about tomorrow and the next day and next week. Well, if they did that, we coded it as next week. We took the time farthest from the present that they said because we were interested in what they call mental time travel, projecting away from the present. Each thought was classified. And then we looked at their rating of how they felt. Just to explain, the line in the middle, that's the present, the 0 line. 0. So that's the present. The past is to the left, and the future is to the right. So as you can see, people reported the highest happiness when their thoughts are really focused right in the present. The more they think about the future or the past, their happiness tends to go down. We had actually predicted this because we thought emotion occurs in the present, and so all emotions should emphasize thinking about the present, and there'll be less emotion as the mind wanders into past and future. Well, that's what we thought, but we were wrong. This was only true for positive feelings. The negative feelings show a different answer. Anger. Oh, I'm sorry. So the 0 is right the present 5 minutes to past and future. -1 is earlier today. -2 is yesterday. -3 is the last few days. -4 is the last week. -5 is the last month. 10 would be the extreme. That would be before I was born. In the same way, the future 1 is later today, then tomorrow, next few days, next week, and so on, and extending up to after the end of my life. The anger, this is the curve that's the best fit. The data are actually more complicated because people are also really mad about some things that just happened. So we probably need a 3 or 4 variable kind of solution. Simply, anyway, to focus right in the present seemed to reduce that. Anxiety, the same thing. It's the lowest right in the present. If you can keep your attention right here, negative emotion tends to drop, and it arises going with the future or the past. Now, in theories of emotion, they often group them on 2 dimensions. They're good to bad emotions, like I've talked about, anxiety versus happiness. The other dimension is arousal. High arousal means your heart is beating and you're all excited and turned on. Like anger and anxiety are high arousal emotions. The negative sadness, however, would be a low arousal emotion. We wanted to get people's ratings on that, so we wanted to ask people. The psychological term is how aroused did you feel? But when you ask people that, they think you're talking about sex. That's interesting too, but that's not what we wanted to know. So we asked them, how excited do you feel? Excitement showed a pure linear pattern, no sign of the quadratic curve there. Basically, the future is exciting, the past is boring. Stress looks like the other negative emotions. It's lowest if you can keep your attention focused right here and now. It's less stressful than when you start to think about, oh my God, my whole life is messed up, going into the far future. The pleasantness of the thought, which is independent from whether you're feeling happy, but the pleasantness of the thought itself. Also, this is a fairly steep curve, and peaks in the present or maybe slightly into the future. The future thing is interesting. My friend George Lowenstein, the economist, did a study once where he asked people, how much would you pay for a kiss to your favorite movie star? And economists generally find that people discount the future, and he had different time things. So things are most valuable in the present. But he found people were willing to pay more for a kiss 3 days from now than for a kiss right away. And I think it's not just so that they could brush their teeth, but for 3 days you can think about, I'm going to get to kiss my favorite movie star. So the anticipation adds to the pleasure. Anyway, we found that the peak seems to be slightly into the future. I don't want to make too much of this because how significant it was, but the peak was a little bit into the future there. So all this suggests that focusing on the present seems to be better. Less negative emotion, more positive emotion. This is what people who study mindfulness say. Oh, get your meditations, get your attention really focused here in the present. It gets rid of stress and pleasant and so on. Well, that's true. But when we ask people how meaningful was the thought, here we found significant, both the linear and the quadratic are significant. The future is by far the most meaningful. The past is the next most, and the present is the least meaningful. So if you keep your, or actually yesterday, it looks like is the least meaningful thing to think about. Yes, if you keep your thoughts focused on the present, it will have positive emotions and low negative emotions, but it's not all that meaningful. Meaning connects across time, and especially orienting toward the future. What happens naturally, this is actually the opposite of what we thought. I thought we're evolved from animals who live in the present, so the natural thing would be for the mind to stay in the present, and you'd have to exert mental effort to make yourself think about the future and the past. But that was clearly wrong. The mind naturally wanders into the future and the past, and you have to discipline and force yourself to stay focused on the present. And my colleague Schooler has studied patterns of when people's mind wanders, and sure enough, when people's mind wanders, it tends to go into the past or the future, rarely dwelling on the here and now. All right, summarizing what I have so far. The present is happy. The future is meaningful. There are many curvilinear relationships in terms of comparing past, present, and future. It's often the present that is different from the past or the future. Negative emotion increases as you move away from the present. And I said the tired mind and the automatic mind wanders in time, especially into the past. So it takes more effort to stay focused on the present. And then, as I said, the future seems to be much more exciting. Now, in terms of linking past, present, and future, remember they were allowed to check yes to past and present, or present and future, or any combination. So what we found was comparing these combinations, they tended to be more meaningful and also to have more negative emotion. And if we take, so comparing the thoughts that only had one, what we call them time zones, past or present or future. If you're only reporting thinking about one of those, it's not as meaningful as if you're thinking of two of those, and all three of them were the most meaningful. But also more anger and frustration and anxiety and other things. So again, the complexity of human life comes from extending across time. Staying in the present is sort of simple and fun and pleasant, even though you have to exert yourself to do that. There's a theory in psychology that when people think about the future, the main thing they're thinking about is their death. This idea goes back to Ernest Becker, an anthropologist, who said, well, humans are the only creatures who know that we are going to die. And that's an existential terror. And so everything we do is sort of trying to cope with that terror. I don't agree with this theory, but I thought we should check and see what they found for it. So the idea then would be thinking about the future would be basically unpleasant, which we did find some negative emotion increasing when they think about the future. However, in our sample, when we asked people, are you thinking about death? The answer was no. About 1 out of every 200 thoughts mentioned death. So it's extremely rare in people's thoughts in everyday life. Also, when they were thinking about death, often they checked the past. So clearly it's not their own death, because they wouldn't have been in our study if they were already dead. So thinking about someone else's death. So thinking about one's own mortality seems to be extremely rare. And you could take a Freudian approach and say, well, maybe it's so terrifying that they repress it and so on. And very hard to measure that. But certainly, if it were that important, you'd expect it to intrude into conscious thoughts more often than it did. We wondered, people are different. So we wondered what kind of people think more about the future. Some probably think more about it than others. We had various pet theories. We didn't have much theory to go on. So we included, I think we had 20 different measures. We had people fill out all these questionnaires and check their age and their gender and everything else to find out what kinds of people think most about the future. We found hardly anything significant. It was common. In fact, all these personality traits that we picked in order to identify who thinks about the future, we had more success picking who thinks about the past. So there are differences. People do differ in terms of who thinks about the future, not so much about the past. So the answer seems to be everybody thinks about the future to about the same amount. There don't seem to be such wide variations. They might vary in how far, but we have enough statistical power to go into that. If there are any effects, optimistic, happy people think a little bit more about the future. Well, it's more fun if you think it's going to be good. And the one personality thing is that people who want to have everything figured out, we call it need for closure. The people who don't like uncertainty, they try to think, okay, exactly what's going to happen next week, and when are we going to meet, and what's going to. So these people want to have everything settled, so they think a little bit more. But other than that, pretty much everybody thinks about the future to the same degree. Thinking about the past, however, is optional. So we looked at the predictors of which thinking about the past. Neuroticism is one of the personality theories evolved where there are now 5 main dimensions through giant statistical analyses of huge samples, the 5 main dimensions of personality. So we included all those to see what happens. So neuroticism is proneness to complain, negative emotions, and so on. Those people think more about the past. Agreeableness is kind of getting along, being friendly with others, and so on. People low in that think more about the past. Conscientiousness is doing what you're supposed to, good self-control, and so on. Low on that, low self-esteem, and so on. And so one of my colleagues who says she never thinks about the past says, well, look at those people. Those are really unpleasant people. The people who think about the past, you don't want to spend the weekend with anybody like that. Argumentative, undisciplined, grumpy, complaining, unfriendly. So, I mean, I don't know what to make of it. That was her bias. But anyway, she does have a point. The thinking about the past doesn't go with the desirable personality traits. All right, so that completes that big study. Now maybe let's move to laboratory work where we can examine causal relationships and test theories more under controlled conditions. So the first thing we do is, well, what happens when people think about the future? When we make people arbitrarily, contemplate their own future, what effect does this have on their behavior? Now, past evidence showed immense amount of data showing that when you ask people to predict the future, they are optimistic. So you get a room full of people and say, well, what are the chances you will get a promotion in work, or you will be fired from work, or you'll have a happy marriage, or you'll get a divorce, or you'll have a gifted child or a retarded child, or you'll be in a car crash, or you'll, on and on. People predict that good things are more likely to happen to me than to other people. Bad things are less likely to happen to me than other people. Across many domains, samples, and so on. So this is consistent. So basically, we started from all this previous work showing the future is essentially bright in people's minds. So we said, well, maybe it's easy to sit down and say, oh yeah, great things will happen to me. I have a bright future. But would they actually, would this translate into behavior? So we said, well, let's first make people think about their future for a little bit, and then give them a choice between a risky, high-reward, high-risk thing, or a play-it-safe option. If they're optimistic, they should go for the risky, high-reward path, whereas if they're pessimistic, then they should play it safe. So the idea, the basic hypothesis is after people think about the future, prospection, they will take higher risks to pursue high rewards. And we had several procedures to do this. We had these studies were done with university students. And so by random assignment, we told half of them, write a few lines about what you think your future will be in 5 or 10 years, what your life will be like then, or write about what your life is like now. So focus on the present or focus on the future by random assignment. Or in another procedure, we simply gave people sentences to write and rewrite in their own words that are referred to thinking about the future or thinking about the past. And that creates, again, a future mindset or a present mindset. And we want to measure then various consequences. So first, let's see, will people invest more in the high-risk, high-payoff investment if they're thinking about the future because they're more optimistic? So we manipulated, write about what your life is going to be like now or in 10 years. Random assignment is, of course, crucial because people are all different, and the differences average out if you randomly assign them, so you get two samples with roughly equivalent characteristics. And then they had to make these investment choices. But contrary to our hypothesis, after they were thinking about the future, they were avoiding risk. A significant drop in being willing to take the risk. So at least on these hypothetical choices for investments, people shifted toward the play it safe. This is what happened to all the optimism. They're not showing any behavioral sign of it. So we thought, well, maybe students don't understand investments. They don't have any money. Let's try something different. Let's try an interpersonal task. Behavioral economists have come up with these procedures for measuring trust. For this, we use the other manipulation. So again, the idea is they're supposed to rewrite these sentences in their own words. So, either the first ones like the first set that would refer to the future, or the ones thinking about the present. The trust game that behavioral economists developed that we borrowed works like this. If you're a subject in it, we give you $10, and you can keep it all, leave the laboratory with $10, that's good, or you can invest it, which means you're sending it to someone else. You have to trust this other person. Whatever you give, and you can divide it up any way you want. But let's say you decide to keep $5 and the other $5 you'll send to the other person. That $5 we transform into $20 and then give it to someone else who then can decide what to do with it between sharing it with you or keeping it. So you have a risk. He'll keep the whole $20 and you'll just have 5 instead of the 10 that you would have had. On the other hand, there's a lot more money. If he says, well, I would have had nothing, I'll keep 10 and send 10 back, then you have 15. So you're better off if you trust him, if he rewards the trust. And this is kind of an analogy to economic investment where people have to work together, trust each other. Each one can betray the other and ruin it and steal it for themselves. But if they both cooperate, then there's more money for everyone concerned. We had people play 10 games with different partners, and we told them one of them will be selected at random and will played for real with real money, and so there was actually money at stake. So we predicted, again, optimism. When you think about the future, that should make them more trusting of this other person. Or it could have been like the other study when thinking about the future made them less optimistic, which we didn't know quite what to do with. Or we thought maybe it's more complicated. Maybe thinking about the future will make people use more relevant information. So we showed them a picture, supposedly, of the other person that they're playing with. Now, these pictures were not really, there was no other person. But these pictures we chose from a database that is established to look trustworthy or not. So here, for example, by random assignment, they got one of these. And the real face is in the middle. And you can see the person on the left looks more trustworthy. It's been computer enhanced or modified to make the person look more trustworthy. The person on the right, less trustworthy, right? I mean, if you find out you're having to trust your money to this guy on the right, you say, oh, I don't know, right? So we thought maybe thinking about the future would make people use this information more. So this is our favorite prediction, that thinking about the future would make people trust the trustworthy person more and not trust the trustworthy person more. But no, what we found was 2 simple main effects. Once again, thinking about the future made people avoid risk. They still responded, so the trustworthy-looking person was trusted more than the untrustworthy looking person. But that was completely independent of this tendency to reduce trust after you've been thinking about the future. So again, the optimism that have been so well documented in all this previous research, we're finding no sign of it. If anything, they seem to be pessimistic, thinking about the future and want to avoid risk. We had a third study on morality. My postdoc who was doing this had done his PhD studying moral judgment. And he thought, well, morality is really a lot about the future as well. So let's try this, see what happens when people have to make moral judgments. If they've been thinking about the future, would they be more forgiving or more punitive? So the same procedure. First, they had to write statements about the present or about the future by random assignment. And then they had to read a story about someone doing something and make a judgment. How much should this person be punished? So, for example, someone set his house on fire to steal, essentially to collect insurance money. The basic finding, thinking about the future, made people blame someone more intensely for bad actions. It did not affect the praise for the virtuous actions that people did. Those were about the same. This fits one of the basic principles that pervade psychology, that bad things have stronger impact than good things. A review article 20 years ago called Bad is Stronger Than Good. It's been cited something like 6,000 times, mostly people saying, oh, here it is again. And, well, here it is again. So when they're judging somebody doing something bad, if they've been thinking about the future, they judge the person more harshly. There's a graph of the results. So the moral ones, that means morally good ones. As you see, whether they're thinking about future or present, no difference. But thinking about the future makes people blame more for the past. So Implication, people are more concerned about the future and problems. See, when other people behave immorally, it creates problems for everyone else. They're more concerned about this than the future and the past, so they condemn wrongdoers. So, summarizing what we found so far, thinking about the future, reduced risk-taking, favoring play-it-safe approach, reduced trust of others, and increased moral blaming. So it seems when people think about the future, instead of this sort of being optimistic, everything's going to work out great, they want to be safe, avoid risk, avoid taking any chances. Well, so I said the future was bright. Our data are suggesting the future is dark. But we believe all the other data that people are predicting all these positive things for them. So how are we going to reconcile this? How do we put it together? Clearly we need some kind of new theory. Well, as I said, most research on the future, thinking about the future, has emphasized people simply just have to make predictions. And so it's easy to say good things are going to happen. But our work says that when they think about the future, they're more preparing for action. And so it's what should I do, what do I need to do, what do I want to do, and so on. So thinking about the future is preparing for your own actions. So predictions are optimistic, but the plans are cautious. What we began to think then is maybe there are two steps in the mental process of thinking about the future. The first one is you want to think about what you want to happen. That's the optimistic one. But then when you think, okay, I would like in 5 years to have a nice car and a lot of money and a beautiful spouse or a handsome spouse or whatever, and all these things. And then you think, well, how do I get there? Oh, this could go wrong and this wrong and so on. So the first is to come up with the ideal positive, and then you think of all the things that can go wrong and you have to make a plan to deal with those. So put it more simply, when you think about the future, the first step is to dream big. And the second then is to get real, as in to deal with how you're going to get there from the present and think of the things that can go wrong. I was having to look over some things online, and I saw a compilation of answers of children wrote to tests in America, and it sort of illustrated these things. What are 3 things you want to do in the future? He writes, get a girlfriend. Okay, that's good. The second one has been erased a lot, but it says kiss her, finally. And then rule the world. So the second one seems to be the get real part after the erasing and thinking it over. That's clearly the step 2. The optimistic rule the world. Well, that's clearly the first step. So how can we test the 2-step idea? My Norwegian colleague said, well, we can look at a time difference. There was a procedure somebody came up with when you put the question on the computer screen and you have a 10-second timer there. And half the people, you tell them, again by random assignment, half the people you say, you need to respond before the 10 seconds are up. So the question shows up, and so respond as fast as you can. And the others, you cannot respond for 10 seconds. So they have to wait 10 seconds to respond. So the idea is that the fast responses should be optimistic, and the slow one should be more realistic or pragmatic. So I did two pre-registered studies. He's now done another large samples and everything. So again, respond fast or slowly after the 10 seconds. And you ask people, what is the probability you will live past 80 years old, or that 5 years from now you'll have a good romantic relationship, successful career, and so on. And sure enough, optimism was faster, or this fast optimism. Optimism was stronger in the immediate responses, that just making people wait 10 seconds was enough to make them suddenly become more realistic. 10 seconds is long enough to say, well, wait a minute. Are you going to live to 80 years old? You say, yes. Well, I do smoke, or I don't exercise, or whatever. So you start to think of negative things. The fast responses were unrealistically optimistic. The slow responses, a tiny bit of optimism there, but significantly less. They were basically realistic. We didn't get pessimism on average, but again, we're only waiting 10 seconds. And the effect, again, bad is stronger than good. The fast optimism effect was bigger for the negative events than the positive ones. So conclude from this part? Yes. The quick predictions about the future are optimistic. When you just ask people off the top of your head, what's the likelihood something great's going to happen to you? They'll say, yes, it's going to happen. But it doesn't take long for that optimism to diminish as people presumably start to think, well, this could go wrong or that could go wrong or there are problems or I'll need to do this first or and so on. And that makes sense. Again, adaptively, how do you pragmatically want to prepare for the future? Think where you want to end up, but then deal with all the obstacles and problems that could prevent you from getting there. Okay, I guess I've already said this. So, thinking of the future starts. Okay, I guess I've said that. All right, the next point, with the research on prediction, they often assume that you can predict the future as if, the future is already determined. There's a long history of this in civilization. People, fortune tellers and horoscopes and all things. And even there's a scientific version in determinism that there's one future, that if you knew all the laws of nature and everything about the universe, you could predict everything in the future with complete accuracy. So this is the idea that there is the future as one single road, that it's already determined, hence the name determinism. Alternatively, there's the idea that future exists in the present as a set of multiple alternative possibilities. Some will come true and some will not come true. And it's yet to be determined, perhaps. So the future is crossroads with multiple possibilities. I don't want to get into the determinism issue, but the ability to think of the future as multiple possibilities, this seems to be something that has only recently evolved. There's a great experiment published a year or two ago by Redshaw and Sudendorf, comparing human children, 2 to 4 years old, versus the most intelligent of our animal relatives, adult chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas. And the procedure they used was that they had a tube and they would drop a treat in the top and it would come out the bottom and then fall into a hole and be gone. So you had to catch it if you wanted to get it. So everybody could pretty much figure out right away, just put your hand under the top, even though it disappears for a moment. The apes had no problem with that. Everybody got it. Then they modified the procedure to put 2 openings at the bottom. So you drop it in the top, and it might come out this side or that side. So now you can guess. 50% of the time get it right, 50% get it wrong. Or, as this girl figures out, if you have 2 hands, you can cover both. But you have to understand that both of them are possible. Okay, so how much did they get this right? Everybody did 20 trials of this. The human 2-year-olds, they didn't really get it. 2 years old, they're still trying to guess which one is going to come out. But by 3 years old, everyone got it. And they got it right away. And by 4, they got it immediately. And then once they solved it, they got it every time. So maybe they guessed the first or second time, and then they used both hands, and then they got it every other time. The apes never figured it out. They were unable to conceptualize that both of these are possible. Some of them even accidentally one time put out both hands and caught it, but they didn't realize that would work every time, and then they went back to guessing. So even if they did solve it by accident, they didn't recognize the solution. And these, again, are our most intelligent animal relatives. But they were unable to conceptualize the future as this matrix of maybe. So again, this seems to be something deeply rooted in human cognition. Again, by 3 years old, all the children could get it, but beyond the capabilities of the adults of our animal relatives. Now, this idea that people think of the future as this matrix of maybes, of multiple alternative possibilities, there's plenty of evidence if you start to look for it in the psychology literature. Ironic things like people will bet more on a future event than a past event. Even though they don't know the outcome, it's the same. So there's a football game, and you're going to bet on who wins. The game is either tomorrow or yesterday. You don't know in either case who won, but people will bet more if the game is tomorrow than yesterday. Or somebody else having a baby. Is it a boy or a girl? They already had the baby, or they haven't had it yet. They'll bet more if the baby's not yet born or early sexed. This makes no rational sense. It's the same probability in either case, but somehow people seem to intuitively feel they have more control, that the future is more open to possibility, and they're more willing to gamble on it. Anticipated emotions are helpful guides. There's a long history of thinking in psychology that emotions are there to drive behavior. The example everyone uses is fear makes you run away, then you're not eaten by the tiger, and you live for another day. It turns out fear doesn't really work like that. But that's the idea. Anyway, very feeble evidence that, and for one thing, there are a lot more behaviors than there are emotions, so it doesn't work. And the psychology literature linking the emotions you're currently feeling to your behavior is very weak and scattered and doesn't work very well. On the other hand, anticipated emotions, when people anticipate how they will feel, this is a strong driver of behavior. So, and indeed, when people act on the basis of current emotional state, even if it does affect their behavior, it's often not adaptive behavior. You know, like they say, you can write the email while you're still angry, but don't hit send. Wait till you're not angry anymore. Doing things in an emotional state is often counterproductive. By anticipated emotion, if you think, I'll be sorry, or I'll feel guilty, or I'll be happy if this happens, those are very important guides to behavior. People moralize the future. I already had some evidence. There's plenty of evidence too. Paradoxically, people will judge the same misdeed more harshly if it's tomorrow than if it was yesterday. Identical misdeed. Moral principles should be the same tomorrow as yesterday, but they make stronger judgments, and even for themselves. Optimistic leaders, some of my friends have shown that the political candidate who predicts the more optimistic future tends to win the election. American presidential elections, something like on the 20th century, something like 17 out of 20, the candidate who spoke more optimistically about the future got more positive votes. Ironically, the study of letters of recommendation, potential is valued more than achievement. So if they say, this person has won an award, it doesn't count as much as this person could win an award, which is really irrational. I mean, the fact that the person did win an award is better than that the person might win an award. But somehow people respond to potential, and something could happen in the future sounds more appealing. There's also evidence. My friend Ariely has this paper called Keeping Doors Open. When there are multiple possibilities, people will pay small amounts of money to preserve their options, even though they're not really all that interested in that option. They just don't like to have it sealed off. And so they try to preserve the multiplicity of options there. All right, what else do we got? Planning. Planning, of course, is essentially pragmatic. Spoke about how common it is there. And you can, the advantage of planning is you can make your decisions about what you're going to do in advance. You don't have to wait to the heat of the moment or the confusion or emotion or whatever. You can decide calmly and rationally, tomorrow when they ask me this, I'm going to say this, or this is the choice I will make, and so on. So you can be prepared. But planning assumes multiple possible outcomes. The reason you have a battle plan is because you might win and you might lose the battle. That's why you need a plan. If you don't need to plan for something that's inevitable. So I'm going to get to the end of this. That's enough of that. In terms of peace of mind versus stressful aspects, the Zeigarnik effect was one of psychology's oldest. It was discovered back in the 1920s, which is that goals, if you're working toward a goal and you're interrupted, you start having automatic thoughts about the goal and intrude into your thoughts. The story goes, the idea for this, a bunch of psychologists in Poland were having lunch together, and they were impressed that the waitress remembered what everyone ordered. And came and served exactly what was right. She didn't write anything down. They thought she must have an extraordinary memory. And then they left and went back to work, except one of them forgot his hat. So I went back and said to the waitress, so I was here with this group. Remember, I brought my hat in. And she had no idea who he was. She said, I don't remember anything. He said, well, come on, you remembered everybody ordered for lunch. And she said, well, as long as it's not served, I remember it. But as soon as the food is served, it's gone from my memory. So there's the idea that the memory keeps nagging you, and the unconscious keeps nagging you to try to remind you that the task is unfinished. Uncompleted goals are there. So there are two main theories about why this is. One is that the unconscious does everything, and consciousness is just sort of along for the ride. So the unconscious lets consciousness know that it's doing it. The other is that the unconscious is nagging the conscious mind. It's saying, come on, you've got to go and get the job done. You've got to finish it. But our colleague showed that neither of those is correct. There's actually a third reason, that if people make a plan, then they stop having these intrusive thoughts. He did studies. Think about the exams you have that are coming up. This was running with students, obviously. And then they had intrusive thoughts about, I need to study and so on. But if they made a plan for when are you going to study for the exam, then the intrusive thoughts stopped, even though they had not done any studying at all. So the implication is this is how the conscious and unconscious mind works together. The unconscious mind is very efficient, but it needs simple instructions, automatic responses. So if you say, well, I need to study for the exam, the unconscious says, you got to tell me more than that. And so it keeps reminding, we got to study, we got to study. But if you make a conscious plan to say, all right, on Tuesday, I'm going to get out my textbook and go over the chapter. On Wednesday, I'm going to review my notes from the lectures. On Thursday, I'll go for the library, and so on. Then you have a specific plan. And then the unconscious will leave you alone until Tuesday morning and says, okay, now it's time to get out the textbook as we planned. So specific instructions will guide the unconscious to work effectively, but it needs the conscious mind to make the planning. And the more precise the plan is, the more effective it is. That's the result of that. Implications, why do you have those annoying thoughts about things you need to do? So if you want to go to sleep at night without being reminded of these things, make a specific plan, and then that will take care of it. It's not that you'll have those annoying thoughts until everything's done. If your life is like mine, you'll never get to the point where everything's done. But at least if you have plans for the main things, then the mind is quiet and can let you go to sleep. Okay, we got a couple more things here. Highly specific plans. When this happens, I will do this, or if this happens, I will respond in this way. We found that planning takes mental effort. I hinted at this before. It takes the automatic, controlled, conscious mind to do it, to form and make plans and to revise them as needed. Kind of an entertaining study my Norwegian colleague did on this. There's a store, IKEA. I don't know if they have it here. Supposedly it's very stressful to shop there, very mentally tiring, a lot of different things to think about. And so his manipulation of mental energy was people either going into the store or coming out of the store. And he asked them, if you had 20 minutes, please tell us how you'd like to do each of these things. Take a relaxing break, or make a plan for the next 4 weeks. Now, you might think, well, they're going into the store, they're thinking about the store, so they don't want to make a plan for the 4 weeks. But when they come out of the store, they're done shopping, that'll be a fine time to make a plan for the next 4 weeks. But no, it's the opposite. Coming out of the store, as you see, they showed no interest in planning. They're mentally tired from their struggle to shop at IKEA. And so their mental energy was low. This is relevant to the ego depletion I talked about yesterday. And so they're not interested in planning. Everybody was interested in taking a mental break. Their goals didn't change either, but their willingness to plan did. So planning takes effort. All right, I think I'm just about out of time. Let me see what else I got. All right, this will be maybe the last one I'll cover, and then we'll summarize. This also Shosta, my Norwegian colleague, did these studies. So what about the future and emotion in terms of managing expectations? So we had our unrealistic goals, or goals that are very hard to reach. If you achieve those, do people desire them all the more? or do they disengage, like the story of the fox who jumped and tried to get the grapes and couldn't get them, and he said, oh, they're probably sour anyway. So he did actually half a dozen studies on this, but I'll just describe one. They all get basically the same result. So first he had people take a little test, and it was called an intuitive intelligence, so people didn't know whether they were getting it right or not, or whether they're good at it. And by random assignment, some of them were told, well, you got 5 out of the 6 correct, and the others were told you only got 2 out of the 6 correct. He says in a couple minutes you're going to have a second test, and if you get all 6 correct, you'll get a prize. And so how happy will you be if you get all 6 of them correct? And then they actually took the second test, and they told everybody they got a perfect score on that to see how happy they actually were. In the pilot study, we had people predict, what do you think other people will do? Who will be happier, the person who got 2 right and then got 6 right, or the person who got 5 right and then got 6 right? Well, people said, the guy who got 2 right on the first round and then got 6 right, he's going to be so happy because he really improved. From 5 to 6, I'll be happy, but, it was kind of what they were hoping for and in the range anyway. So Aesop was wrong, it appears. It's more the grass is greener. You can usually find proverbs for opposite hypotheses in psychology. So when they're predicting for what other people will do, at least, people said, no, going from 2 to 6 should produce the maximum happiness. But when predicting for themselves, it was the other way around. Their Aesop was right. So in terms of the prediction, the people who got 2 right, the low achievers, the blue bar, they predicted how happy would you be if you got all 6 right on the next test. I said, I don't care. Intuitive intelligence, that's bullshit. That means nothing to me. I don't care about this stuff. Whereas if they got 5 out of 6 right, then they thought, oh yeah, I'd be pretty happy. Then he gave them the second test, and they told them all they got 6 right. Well, everybody's really happy. So this was clearly a motivated disengagement to say, oh, I got 2 right. I don't care about this stuff. This is stupid. Even if I got all 6 right, it wouldn't mean anything to me. But then when they did get 6 right, they were plenty happy. So it's sort of a defensive distancing yourself from it. So people adjust their expectations downward and assume a goal that they think is unreachable will not bring them any joy. All right, my time's about up. Let me just go to the main conclusions. First, I call the primacy of prospection, that people think much more about the future than the past. And psychology study the past. Well, the past is important too, but we need to shift our emphasis and pay more attention to the future and think about the future itself or the future in relation and combination with the present. And as I noted, even when people are thinking about the past, they're often thinking about the implications for the future. It's mainly the fairly near future, which again focuses on the pragmatic. It's more important to prepare for tomorrow than for something in 20 years. So a lot of the thoughts are on the near future. As I said, also they're focusing on the multiple possibilities, things that might happen, might not happen. They're not predicting what's certainly going to turn out. They're looking for the choice points where multiple things can happen. Emphasis on how am I going to deal with this. Planning, as I said, I got these 2 slides mixed up, sorry. Planning is more meaningful than other thoughts about the future, emotionally positive. It takes a lot of effort and so on. We had all these hypotheses. Would people do more planning when they're alone or when they're with others? And despite the statistical power of 500 people, there was no difference. People think about the future and plan as much when they're alone as with others. As I said, thinking about the present brings more happiness. Thinking about the future is more meaningful, and especially linking across time. The most meaningful thoughts were ones where they said yes to past and present and future. So if you're thinking about all 3 time zones at once, those are the most meaningful thoughts. Planning there. And again, thinking about the future, 2 big steps. There's the first, the dream big, and then the get real. Think about what you want to happen, what ideally the outcome you're desiring, and then how to get there, where you start to work on what can go wrong and so on. Both are important. My colleague Oettingen has shown people who only do one or the other don't get where they want to nearly as well as people who do both steps. And you don't just think about what's the best case, you want to think about all the possibilities as well. Anyway, to conclude, the past can be known, but the future is open to be shaped and changed, and so it's really adaptive and important, and a basic part of human psychology to think about the future. Seems to be something we're much more capable of than other animals. And as a final thought, one of my students found this for me, a basketball player who took out the rearview mirror from his car so that he can't look back. It's a thing about the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I will run around again with the microphone for the sake of the recording and answer questions. Just a moment, I'm coming there to you.
Thanks a lot for the very interesting talk. Fascinating. I was just very curious. Can you explain the anger plot? How people thinking of the future can get angry, like especially because we saw that it peaked close to the afterlife.
Okay. No, I'm only speculating here because we didn't get them to explain why. But you know, if somebody did something bad, say yesterday, so you're angry about it, but if it's over and done with, well, okay, it's too bad, but it's done. But if it's going to create problems for you extending into the future, then you're going to have to deal with that. And the longer in the future the problems will extend, the more angry you will be. So that's my guess, is the long-term implications. The more trouble it's going to make for you.
And how do you know that animals don't think about the future and they are constantly present?
Okay, this is not my work. There's a paper in Press on behavioral brain sciences that should be online that suggests animals are not able to even reason in time. And there's a review article by Roberts, 2002, saying, "Are animals stuck in time?" And they review the evidence as well. Things that look like the animals are planning for the future, often they're not. They're hardwired responses. I remember a study of squirrels. They have squirrels over, they bury nuts and things. So it looks, they bury them in the summer and then they dig them up in the winter. So it looks like they're putting things away for the future. But they don't have an idea that, come February, I'm going to want to eat this. The researchers came once and dug up all the acorns, the nuts that they'd buried, and the squirrels just went on doing the same thing they'd done. If somebody came into your house and took all the food, you would say, well, I have to go and buy a whole bunch more food to replace that. But they didn't seem to have that. They even took them and moved them. So what they concluded is the squirrel sort of has a impulse to say, well, this looks like a good place to bury a nut, and then months later, this looks like a good place to dig for a nut, and it finds it and eats it, but it doesn't connect those in its mind. There's also a story about, there's a lot more evidence in the Roberts article. It's in Psychological Bulletin if you want to read this. There's a study of monkeys, and they fed the monkeys once a day. And monkeys like to eat all day, so they fed them once a day. They could have all the food they wanted at noon, and then no more for 24 hours. So by 11 the next morning, they're really starving. But all they had to do was save some of the food, but they never got the idea that I'll want this tomorrow morning, even though they had plenty of time to get used to this feeding schedule. Come noon, the food would be put out, they'd eat all they wanted, and then, they'd have food fights, throwing it at each other and things like that. But saving it, carrying it away for tomorrow, they never got the idea. There are lots of studies of animal expectancies and so on. Also, I know I'm thinking, extending into the past, the reward stuff. If say a rat performs something and is rewarded for it or punished, then that learns to do the rewarded and not. If the reward comes right away, like within half a second, it learns pretty fast. If it's a 5-second delay, it only learns after hundreds of trials. And a 10-second delay, I think it never learned. So just 10 seconds was enough to detach. So that kind of evidence suggests, again, that they don't connect very well across time. There's plenty more evidence in the other thing, but yeah, okay. Next.
Yeah, we have a second question here.
Do you think your findings persist across multiple cultures? I was just thinking about the cultural variable and about, I was thinking maybe it's something American. Maybe it would be different in another country.
Yeah, there's no way to know without doing the studies in other cultures. There is some evidence that other cultures, especially very different ones, I mean, come to Switzerland or Germany, it's probably not going to be all that different. But if they say go into New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, or someplace where people live very different lives, then the ideas might be different. I'm guessing some of the patterns will be the same, but you know, for one thing, the future is socially constructed. Like, this is Friday, and so in 3 days it will be Monday. You know, we have a weekend coming up in between. This is something that's culturally created, and so on. If you live as a hunter-gatherer, you don't have weekends, and so yeah, we can make an airplane reservation for a vacation for next year, you know, based on knowing exact dates, and there'll be this flight and this vacation resort, and they will have a hotel room for you, and you can make all these plans. So that is part of the shared understanding of the future that the culture builds up, the scaffold. In terms of other findings about the future, the optimism and so on, I don't know. I would love to get data from other cultures too. It's just much more difficult to do. Anyway, I wish I had more. This is what we have so far.
Okay, so we have 2 questions.
Hello. In the studies you presented, you usually use positive motivation to get something out of the people. Is it possible to get different results if you use negative motivation, punishment? Because very often that's the case in real life. You punish kids for misbehaving, or if you don't make enough money, you don't pay your mortgage, and then you are screwed. So if that changes the results or the observations.
Yes. Well, I mean, the things like the trust game, there's a possibility for a bad outcome as well as a good outcome. You can lose all the money that you have. We can't really make people give up their own money when they come to participate in research. So they leave, you know, they pay us to be in our experiment. So it's a little bit harder to do that. I would say, again, based on this general principle that bad is stronger than good, anticipating negative things would intensify some of these effects to some degree, and probably for biologically adaptive reasons. If you miss out on a good thing happening, like a good meal you could have had or whatever, well, that's no great loss. But if you make a mistake and fall into some danger, you could die. We say life has to win every day, death only has to win once. So avoiding negative things is even more important. The optimism is there, and the optimistic bias shows up regardless of whether people are predicting good things or bad things. So, you know, if they're predicting what are the chances you'll have a car crash or lose your job or get a divorce or be really sick or something like that, again, people are more optimistic about themselves. That's less likely to happen to me. I forget if the effect size is larger than with positive outcomes. But you know, that kind of thing is there. Nevertheless, my general assumption would be negative things have stronger impact, and so the need to prepare for them and avoid them and so on would be a stronger motivation.
Maybe that's not your field of expertise, but do you have an idea why monkeys or general animals didn't evolve any kind of temporal sense, like what you explained with the meal in noon? Because they develop, I don't know, special limbs to handle everything, right? Everything evolves.
Yes.
But this, I don't know, time connectivity simply didn't, or why?
You got me there, and explaining why something did not evolve is, I don't even know what kind of theory to do for that. I mean, my guess would be it's a fairly advanced function and very difficult to do. The brain evolved first to see what's there, and maybe then to have a little bit of idea of what could be there in a short time. And the brain evolved to store lessons from the past. See, there are two kinds of memory. There's one where you can remember walking on the beach last summer with your loved one and so on. You kind of replay the scene in your mind. It turns out you don't replay it, you reconstruct it, how it must have looked. And many people will recall the scene of them walking on the beach as viewed from overhead, which is clearly not the way they experienced it. They say, like, remember the last time you went swimming. And people will say, okay, when the last time I went swimming? Okay, that was 3 weeks ago. I was in this pool. They picture the pool and they picture themselves swimming up and down. That's obviously not a replay of the way they experienced it. But the other, and that one seems to be more uniquely human, as the memory people say. The first thing was simply learning that something is bad, and so they carry the lesson forward. And so they respond to the stimulus like, oh, this is dangerous. This animal beat me up last time we interacted, so I avoid it. Or I ate this and it was good, and it tasted good, and I felt good afterwards. That kind of lesson was the most important thing for animals to learn, and they learned from that. Projecting into the future, more difficult, and fairly limited expectancies. And again, the Roberts article concluded that the smartest animals can only project about 20 minutes into the future. So, for example, sometimes a chimpanzee, they have limited tool use, like they'll take a stick and stick it into a hole, and then the bugs will crawl on it, and they put it on, they eat the bugs. There are cases where the chimpanzee will see a good stick when he's going to get food and carry it off to another place. And then stick it into a hole there. So it looks like they're projecting. But again, about 20 minutes is about as much as is proven. And my guess is much more difficult in terms of brain hardware that was required to really be able to visualize past events and then visualize future events. And remember, we not only visualize what happened, but we can visualize alternative possibilities. There's very little evidence that any other animal can do that. I was just reading a chapter yesterday of deliberately practicing something, like, you'll practice the piano or you'll practice your serve in tennis or whatever. The animals don't do that because they don't have a sense of the future. They will do something over and over again, but deliberate, intentional practice as a way of building a skill for the future, that seems to be completely absent in other species. So, again, my guess is it's just it took the really extraordinary human brain. I was saying yesterday that the brain is a very expensive organ biologically. It consumes a lot more calories in proportion to its body weight, and so growing a bigger and bigger brain stopped for most animals when it had enough to deal with the environment and survive and reproduce. It only expanded with humans, I'm saying probably because of communication, because we shared information, so there was more of a brain to do, and so there were more biological advantages for smart brains, possibly even at the group level, that groups that shared information and communicated were able then to outcompete other groups that didn't share information, and that would create the natural selection advantage for a larger brain. So going to the future probably went along with that.
Hey. I was wondering if you have looked into gender differences or differences between age groups for the future thoughts and future optimism.
Yes, we did, and there was hardly any difference. We thought old people think more about the past because they have more past and less future. I remember there was a study of mind wandering that my colleague Schooler did with his friend, and a small one, where they have people reading a novel like War and Peace, and they stop them at random and say, well, were you daydreaming just now? And if so, what were you daydreaming about? And they first did it with students, and the students were daydreaming. They were thinking more about the future than the past when they daydreamed. But those were young people. So I thought, well, what about old people? And I had a postdoc who was interested in aging, so she got an elderly sample and put them through the same procedure. But they did the same thing. There was about 3 times as much of the future than the past. So there might have been a tiny difference. In terms of gender, there were, obviously with 500 people you can get a significant difference, but it's so tiny it's effectively meaningless. And that's what we got. I think women think a little bit more about the past. And then the present future, the men thought slightly more about one of those and the other was equal. But all the differences were so tiny as to really not amount to much. I mean, some thinking about the past is sort of ruminating about bad things, thinking bad thoughts. So women are a little more depressed than men. And so they're a little bit more prone to that. I suspect if you corrected for the depression, there would have been no gender difference at all. So we tried. Yeah.
Hi, I'll follow up a bit on this question. Did you have data or numerical data on low-income, high-income families, or for example, people who grew up in a situation that they had to think about the tomorrow, the next day, a lot, and people who grew up, for example, in this comfortable situation, having this prospects for the whole future and college studies and so on? Did you see any differences how they think about the past, link past, present, and future, and think about long-term future?
I would have to look that up. I mean, the fact that it's not in my slides suggests there was no difference, but maybe we didn't have enough of a sample to do that. Now, there are arguments that, yes, that thinking far into the future is more the luxury of middle and upper class people, and many, people from the lower class, they live sort of week to week and don't really have a grand plan of where they want to be in 5 years. Even just say going to university and getting a degree in a career, I mean, that's a long-term sort of planning that goes with more middle and upper class approach to life. And some of that, people are saying that it's not really part of the genetic tendencies or intelligence or anything like that, that if you grow up in a poor household, the future is much more unpredictable, and so it doesn't pay to think very far into the future. Yesterday I was talking about self-control and the lower self-control in the lower classes, but what people say is the delay of gratification of planning for the future, it doesn't work as well in that classes. Say in the middle class household, if the child wants something, wants a treat, the mother might say, well, okay, you can have the treat next week if you do your piano lessons every day until then. And the child says, okay, and then does the piano lessons and then gets the treat a week from now. But in the lower class household, the parent might say, oh, well, you can do that next week, but then there's a crisis or a problem, and we can't do it, and so you can't get the treat anymore. So even the same child might learn, I'm not going to count on their promises for next week, I want it right now. And so, which, is adaptive in that environment, but not so much to success in a middle-class oriented society.
Okay, so thanks everybody for this interest. Kindly the lecturer sent me the papers that are mentioned at the end of the slides, and the slides and papers are all on the 2 Indico events. So you can go and read the details of these conclusions. So let us thank very much again Dr. Baumeister.